Hello everyone! This week we're going to be looking at selections from the Preface by William Wordsworth and selections from Biographia Literaria by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I've chosen these two texts because they philosophically explore theories of poetry that were early in Romanticism, but that also show the tensions between realism and fantasy that we're going to be studying in a lot of the literature this semester. So even though these two particular texts are specific to poetry, what we're going to find is that they echo a lot of the divisions that we looked at last week between fantasy and realism. So let's go ahead and make sure that you've read both of those selections before you continue with the lecture, so that way the examples and references that I give you will make more sense. So please be sure to do that before you proceed. Let's start with some historical context. You'll remember from last week that due to the Enlightenment, fantasy was beginning to be discouraged in literature. Writers were focusing more on the usual, the natural, the general, what was common sense, what was everyday. They wanted to show people what was eternal and unchanging, understood by all people, and not what was particular or what was unique, especially if that was something that had to do with things that were mythical or supernatural or idealized. This, of course, was due to the influence of science. Readers and writers wanted themes that could be demonstrated as true based on common experiences. Again, thinking of literature as almost being empirical, something that you could read and verify and know that was true. This was the influence of the Age of Reason. And what happens is there's a conflict between reason, which could provide one possible truth, and fancy, which is the 19th century word for fantasy, which would provide multiple subjective interpretations. And this conflict that we're going to be following this semester really comes to a head at the beginning of the 19th century. So as the Age of Reason progresses, those 18th century Enlightenment values really shaped taste in literature to the point where people began to feel that there was almost too much of an emphasis on reason, and that writers were focusing so much on reason and rationality and empiricism that there was this loss happening to the importance of the emotions and of imagination. So what happens in the 19th century, the late 18th, early 19th century, is that you have this return to the importance of fairy tale and fantasy. Romantic writers, who are early 19th century writers, are arguing for the value of imagination again. They're pushing back against this concept that reason has to be primary all the time, and that's the only way that literature can be good is that if it's appealing to reason. What they're basically going to say, and what you'll see in the literature this week, is that not everything has to be always driven through reason, that there can be imaginative truths and emotional truths that aren't provable and knowable, but that are still valuable. Fantasy itself as a genre is still going to be viewed with some suspicion because it is technically overtly false and therefore a technical lie. So a lot of fantasy tales, what you'll see is that they often contain allegory or morals at the end of them, so that readers are constantly reminded of what is real versus not real. And that is especially true in things like fairy tales, which we'll look at a little bit later in this semester, where you have these sort of morals appended to fairy tales in order to make sure that at the end of it, readers aren't confused and they understand that giants aren't real and ogres aren't real, and so that the fairy tale was told for a moral purpose and not to trick people. So there's this kind of suspicion that fantasy can't really be the best because it's always telling lies. But what romantics do is they're going to say there's still value in those type of tales. So romantics are going to reject this emphasis on reasoning from the 18th century, but they're not going to reject the need for truth. So the delivery of truth could now appeal to emotions and imagination and not just to rationality. So they're keeping that emphasis on wanting literature to tell the truth, but they're just going to say we can do that in a wide variety of ways. It doesn't have to be from writing mimetically or realistically and copying the world as we see it. So this move toward realism is going to continue on one trend, but we're also going to have this other trend of more imaginative fantasy literature that's coming in. And I've put the dates for Romanticism and Victorianism here. Those are the two major movements in literature, as well as aestheticism at the end, although we won't be looking at that quite as closely. These are the two major movements of the 19th century. So we're starting with Romantic writers, and we'll be moving into Victorian writers as we go, and there may be some overlap as well as we go throughout this semester. But in both cases, Romantic and Victorian writers are wanting to reclaim fantasy and to introduce the importance of things like mythical ideas and characters to their readers, but still with the goal of telling some kind of truth to their readers. Now this week we're going to be looking at the preface to Lyrical Ballads, and I chose this as an example of an important text that really shifts from the 18th century into what would be considered the new Romantic movement. Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798, which is generally the agreed upon date for when Romanticism really takes over from the Enlightenment in terms of literary studies. Lyrical Ballads itself is an anthology of poems. It was written by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, combining poems from each poet. And it was considered to be a very experimental book. So the collection itself focuses on marginal figures, people who are outcasts, who are solitary. Some of them are children, some of them experience madness. And the poetic form itself that they're trying to incorporate into this text blends what's considered to be a private lyric style with a public ballad style. So lyrical ballads meaning also something about form here, that it's a hybrid form that's trying to do something new. So because it had such an impact, what happens is it's published, it gets a lot of attention, a lot of reviews, some good and some bad. There's some disputes about who was more important in the text, whether Wordsworth had more influence or Coleridge had more influence. And what happens is when it comes out in a next edition, Wordsworth decides to write a preface to clarify some of the principles for how they're writing this new poetic form, why he and Coleridge decided to do this, and then just kind of clarify some of his personal philosophy about poetry and its importance and what a poet should be doing. So the preface is sort of looking back on the original publication of Lyrical Ballads and thinking through what they wanted to accomplish. And then the next edition that came out had this long preface, and you've read some selections of that for this week. Now, before I tie the preface to our overall course themes, what I wanted to do was pull out a couple of Wordsworth's points that were really considered to be different and unusual for his time period. The first thing that he's really noted for here in the preface is describing the way that poems should be written the way people actually speak. So rather than having poems be full of this symbolic and almost sometimes obscure language, he is saying instead the poet is, and this is his quote, a man speaking to men. So it's supposed to be almost conversational and written in a way that people can understand even if they aren't highly educated. So his poetry is going to be more basic in terms of symbolism. It's not going to have as many allusions to other literary texts in it because he wants it to be understood. Again, thinking about how this could be connected to realism, that the poet should write about things that are everyday. He does, though, say that everyday, but colored over with imagination, right? So in an unusual way. This is where the Romantics are pushing back against the Enlightenment theories of reason. The imagination becomes important because it's going to help transform the ordinary and provide wonder to the reader. So still taking for its subject things of rustic life, things that are more natural, hypothetically, and we can talk about that in our discussions as well, less restrained by conventions, things that are more focused on how things should be rather than how they actually are in the city. So what I mean by that is people can be too overwhelmed by conventions, too overwhelmed by society's expectations. And Wordsworth is going to suggest that real poetry should focus on people in their more natural state rather than when they're bound up by convention and kind of practicing in society. So he's asking us to think of poetry as something that could be more humble. That's probably the best way to think of it. And this was a really different idea for the time period. So typically, a writer's highest aspiration would be to write poetry, and it would be full of all these sorts of classical allusions going all the way back to Greek history and classical philosophy. But Wordsworth is saying, actually, no. What we can do is make poetry simpler, we can make it written in a way that people can understand, and it can be much more democratic in terms of who is reading it. So in this case, he's shifting the audience and he's shifting the way that poetry speaks. And that's another reason why Lyrical Ballads was considered to be really revolutionary at the time, is because it was trying to do something really different than historically poetry had done up until this point. Wordsworth also reintroduced this theory of imagination as important to the composition process for a poet. And the poet is, in his definition, supposed to be using imagination within contemplation to describe the everyday world in a new way. So I want you to listen to his description and maybe reread it in the text and think about the way that he's blending fantasy terms with realist terms here. The poet has the ability to conjure up in himself feelings that are the same as those experienced in reality, even if he has not experienced them himself. So even if you as a poet don't experience an actual thing, you can still write about it because you're going to conjure up in yourself feelings and emotions that you imagine to be similar and appropriate to that situation. And using that imagination, you can slip into, as he says, an entire delusion that allows you to identify with feelings that you want to describe. So rather than just writing poetry from observing the real world, as it would have happened possibly in the 18th century, or being extremely educated and knowing all your classical allusions and multiple languages and writing poetry from that, instead you're going to observe reality, and then you're going to go into your own mind. You're going to think through the emotions that you think would best decide and depict a particular situation, and actually allow your imagination to put you into a delusion so that you are re-experiencing and then recreating those particular emotions that are appropriate to that situation. The best kind of a poet would then, in that delusion, select what he feels is most true and present those in the poem. But notice how Wordsworth still describes this in terms of science. So like the scientist, the poet's goal is to seek truth and to present it to readers. Now, this description of conjuring and delusions doesn't exactly sound like scientific terms, but beneath this, right, is still that 18th century emphasis on empiricism and reason. So the goal is truth. Truth is primary. That's what the poet is working towards. That's the purpose of the poem, is to reveal truth in the world. But the method is a little bit different for romantics. The method involves more imagination. Now, when Wordsworth wrote the preface, he was really trying to articulate the reasoning behind Lyrical Ballads. But remember, Lyrical Ballads was written by both himself and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And what happened was, Coleridge wasn't exactly happy with the way that Wordsworth has defined their goals and Wordsworth had defined the purpose of poetry. He didn't completely agree. So he decided to do his own version of that in Biographia Literaria, which is his literary biography. So it's very, very long. Biographia Literaria is it's multiple volumes. But this particular section that I had you read describes the time in his life when he and Wordsworth were composing Lyrical Ballads together, when they were talking about what poetry should do and be, and it shows a divergence from Wordsworth's philosophy into his own. And it's important here to distinguish between the two because both these philosophies were working in Lyrical Ballads, and it really shows how the push towards fantasy was sometimes in tension with the push towards truth. So for Coleridge, he identifies two cardinal points of poetry, and he's saying that poetry should be truthful, yes, as Wordsworth said, but also imaginative, and he's really going to emphasize imagination. So he's saying that we need to excite the sympathy of a reader by adhering to the truth of nature and giving interest through novelty by modifying things from nature with the imagination. So what that essentially means is, yes, show the real world, but make sure imagination is really playing a big role for readers too, not just for the poet and the way that poems are composed. So the poem needs to communicate that truth, but pleasure for Coleridge is going to be the primary goal. It's going to privilege pleasure over truth. Truth should not be the main point of poetry, Coleridge is going to argue. The poet is one whose goal is not to find truth like a scientist, as Wordsworth would say, but to bring the whole soul of man into activity. The poet is supposed to be reconciling opposites, bringing unity, and doing this through imagination. And that goal and those differences are pretty distinct, so I want us to look at those side by side. Coleridge explains for us that Lyrical Ballads was intentionally divided into two different types of poems. Coleridge himself was going to produce supernatural poems, and we'll actually be reading his most famous one next week from Lyrical Ballads. It's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. His type of poetry was going to use fantasy to create dramatic truth. This is different from Wordsworth's goal. Dramatic truth does not have to be realistic in the way that it's portraying certain events or people. It can use magic and can use imagination wildly. It can use different sorts of scenarios as long as the truth is coming from emotions and not mimesis or realism. Wordsworth, however, was going to focus on ordinary life poems. These were going to be ones that show everyday characters, incidents in typical villages, and the truth will come from recognition of the everyday. Even though it's presented in a novel way, even though imagination has a role in the way that the poet creates and the way that the reader responds, the basic demonstration of truth comes from recognition, looking to the poem, reading it, and saying, yes, I can see this in my own experience. It is something I recognize, and that truth is there for me. So notice then how this description from Biographia Literaria is echoing this division between fantasy and realism that we have already identified so far last week. And just to make it even more clear, I've put another table, just like last week's lecture, the fantasy versus realism. I have Wordsworth versus Coleridge here with their different objects of poetry. So let's look at these side by side now. So Wordsworth is prioritizing truth, and his quote is, "Poetry's object is truth, not individual and local, but general and operative," meaning truth that can be demonstrated based on common human experience. Coleridge, however, is going to prioritize pleasure. He says a poem is that species of composition which is opposed to works of science. So think about that. Wordsworth is describing himself as a scientist, scientist-minded poet. Coleridge is saying, actually, no. Poetry is opposed to science because it's proposing pleasure as its immediate object, not truth. So this is a different way of thinking about what the work of literature should be doing. For Wordsworth, pleasure is not absent, but it emerges from the demonstration of truth. Again, like with realism, gaining new knowledge, incorporating that, thinking about how that reflects and broadens our experiences, gives us pleasure because we've uncovered something new information about the world. This is where Wordsworth says truth is the most important, and that's what poetry should be doing. For Coleridge, truth is not absent from poetry, but it is secondary to the form of delivery. A poem must prioritize pleasure, because otherwise, why are we writing it with meter and rhyme? Why not just write a scientific essay if truth is the only goal? So he's saying because we have meter, because we're forming it as a poem, because we're emphasizing the language and the imagery, obviously we're prioritizing pleasure over truth. So the enjoyment of the form of the poem outweighs any truth that the poem can provide beyond that imaginative pleasure. So the pleasure then will come from the poet's ability to fuse opposites, to create something completely new and unexpected. However, Wordsworth is still going to argue the poet is supposed to be showing something universal and truthful. So it's not something that's totally new, but it should be recognized by the reader. And that pleasure that we get comes from recognizing the truth because the poet has used his imagination to help us recreate that truth and re-see it. So you can see this tension, right? And even the two probably most famous poets of the Romantic era are kind of butting heads here about what poetry should be doing, with one picking a more realist approach and one picking a more fantastical, imaginative approach. So for Wordsworth, what we want to focus on is how truth, even through the use of imagination, employs many of the aesthetic values of Enlightenment thought, the emphasis on reason, the uncovering of truth, the universal or common human experience being prioritized. For Coleridge, he's really pushing towards that new romanticism that prioritizes pleasure and fantasy. So pleasure and learning becomes a very influential educational theory in the 19th century, and that's also some of what he's drawing from. But what we're going to see is that the 19th century writers like Coleridge are going to grapple with these sort of changing roles. How do we still incorporate truth while also giving pleasure? How do we claim fantasy for ourselves and react against too much reason and rationality while still saying that we want truth to be part of the reason that we're writing? So keep these things in mind, these divisions that are happening here, and what we're going to see over the next few weeks is that these things are going to intersect in pretty interesting ways. So as we finish up the lecture for this week, I want to leave you with thoughts about how the modes persuade. So we want to think about how realism, if truth is the primary goal, then the mind needs to be persuaded. Texts that are trying to be realistic are working to persuade readers' rationality, and they're appealing to the material world and to universal experiences that many people would have so that they can have pleasure in saying, yes, I recognize that, I see myself in that, I know that that's true, and that makes me happy that someone else has written about it and experienced that too. If we're talking about how fantasy persuades to pleasure, and if pleasure itself is the primary goal, then we're really thinking about texts that are moving the spirit and the emotions and not necessarily the mind. In this case, novelty can be one of those ways that fantasy persuades. It's appealing to things that are unusual, that are marvelous, that are unexpected, that are out of this world, and that pleasure that comes is through this surprise. And that is really different than the confirmation of what is already known, which is where pleasure comes from in realism. So both of these modes are using imagination, both are using emotion, but they're really moving towards truth in quite different ways. And I want you to really be able to think through how your own personal preferences for reading are being influenced by these differing goals, and whether if you prefer realism or if you prefer fantasy, how the authors may be working to create certain situations that could be true or that could be marvelous and unusual in order to move your emotions or your mind as you read their literature. So this is what Wordsworth and Coleridge were thinking through in terms of their poetic philosophies. And these particular philosophies are really going to be touchstones for us as we go throughout this semester, thinking about these tensions between the modes.